Hello, everybody. In Module 1, I'm going to provide introduction to theory. Then I'm going to talk about traditional models of capital markets and how disclosure affects various capital market outcomes. The module is going to be divided into 6 submodules or 6 lessons. Today, we focus on Lesson 1, how to consume theory papers. When do we need theory? Well, very often we do not. Very often, we can just use verbal arguments or draw simple graphs. For example, if there is some exogenous shock that increases the supply of certain goods, but the demand stays the same, then price is going to decrease. You don't need a theory for that. You can either argue verbally or draw a demand-supply graph. Then when do we need theory? In my opinion, under 2 cases. The first case is when theory can provide a general framework that gives guidance on whether a certain issue matters or does not matter, with clearly laid out assumptions. My favorite example is the Modigliani-Miller theorem. The theorem states that capital structure does not matter if there is no informational frictions, there is no tax, there is no bankruptcy, etc. However, in reality, we know that capital structure matters. So that means at least one of the Modigliani-Miller assumptions must be violated. Alternatively, if you're an empiricist interested in exploring the variation of capital structure among different firms, but in your setting, none of the Modigliani-Miller assumption is violated, then, based on theory, there is no clear interpretation of your results. The second case is when theory can provide guidance on empirical research. Theory can provide guidance on various aspects of empirical research. For example, what is the precise definition of certain empirical constructs? What is the precise definition of pricing formulas? What is the precise definition of illiquidity? Theory can provide guidance on research design. For example, if I'm interested in testing whether or not managers learn from the stock markets, what variable should be the dependent variable? What variable should be the independent variable? Theory can also provide guidance on interpreting results. Is this an earnings management story, or is this a strategic withholding information story? You may think that theory comes first, and then empirical literature either confirms or refutes the theory. In reality, sometimes empirical findings come first, and then new theory develops to try to explain those empirical findings. One example is rational inattention, that we're going to talk about in Module 6. You may not have read any theory papers before. This may be the first time you're reading theory papers. What does a theory paper consist of? A theory paper consists of 2 parts. The first part is the setup, the model, and the details of the model. We call that description of the environment. What is the setting? Who are the players? What choices they're making? And those choices are endogenous components. Every theory paper would have exogenous components, and they would have assumptions on exogenous components. We're going to talk in more detail about exogenous versus endogenous components in the next slide. But here's an example. Suppose you're focusing on firm's disclosure behavior. You may want to take the production technology of the firm as given or exogenous, or you may want to take the macroeconomic conditions as given or as exogenous. The second parts are the results or solutions of the model. Players, they make choices to maximize their payoffs. So the solutions are usually obtained through some sort of optimization techniques. Once the model is solved, you get the solutions, you get the results, which are the equilibrium endogenous choices. And then, very often, a theory paper would try to link those endogenous choices with exogenous parameters. Those comparative statics serve as the basis of empirical implications, how certain endogenous choices vary with certain exogenous parameters. And it's very important to separate exogenous from endogenous parts of the theory paper. Exogenous components are usually what the model thinks is unimportant, so the model abstracts away. Again, coming back to the firm disclosure models. The firm disclosure models usually, they do not focus on macroeconomic conditions, or they think macroeconomic conditions are not the first order effects in determining firms' disclosure strategies. So in this case, usually they treat those as exogenous. However, If you're studying whether or not firms' disclosure behavior affects macroeconomic outcomes, then you cannot treat macroeconomic conditions as exogenous. The endogenous components, those are the key part of the paper. And very often, a theory paper would try to provide counterintuitive results regarding how certain endogenous components vary with exogenous components. For example, more information may not necessarily lead to better investment efficiency. However, note that those endogenous components and exogenous components, they may or may not be empirically observed. So try to testing those empirical implications presents additional challenges. Now, how to read theory papers? It depends on whether or not you want to be a theorist or not, and whether or not you have sufficient amount of time. If you want to be a theorist, or if you have sufficient amount of time, this is my suggestions. You need to know when to focus on the big picture takeaways versus the details of the papers, including the models, the details of the models, and the details of the solutions. In my opinion, if you want to be a theorist, at the beginning, it's better to focus on the details. And then think, possibly through working through the algebra, how those details lead to the big picture takeaways, the so-called intuition. It's very important that you start in this way. You incur all those hard work, because once you have enough experience, then whenever you come across with a model, you look at the details, you have a rough idea of how the intuition works. So you can focus on looking at the big picture takeaways. You only look at the details if the big picture takeaways are not consistent with your common intuition. But to create the common intuition, you need to focus on details at the very beginning. And a lot of theory papers, they require reading multiple times to understand the intuition, because sometimes the underlying intuition is quite subtle. I myself very often find that I gain new insights from reading the same paper, maybe for a 10th or 15th time. Well, this may sound like it's very time-consuming and requires a lot of effort, but don't be discouraged, because very often models that seem hard to begin with, if you work with them for some time, incurring some hard work, it will seem much easier. And I speak of that from my own experience. So those are the suggestions for how to read theory papers if you want to be a theorist or you have plenty of time. What if you're an empiricist, you just want to consume theory papers, you don't have enough time? So what are you going to do? Very often, as an empiricist, you have very interesting findings, and your objective is to looking for a good theoretical framework, for a good theory paper, to motivate and interpret the findings. You find a good story to tell that is theoretically based and is consistent with your findings. In this case, you can focus first on the big picture takeaways of the theory papers, because the big picture takeaways are inconsistent with your findings. You don't need to waste the time looking into the details. However, once the big picture takeaways are consistent with your findings, you still need to pay attention to the details. In particular, the assumptions underlying the papers. Are those assumptions satisfied in your empirical setting? And then think about whether or not the whole setting fit into the setting for your empirical research question. And to do this, again, you need to understand the details. You need to understand what the model is talking about, what is the setting, who are the players, what are the critical assumptions, and then how the details lead to the picture takeaways, the so-called intuition or the driving force of the model. So now I'm going to give you an example. Suppose you have some empirical findings in a setting which is related to managers manipulating earnings to deceive investors. That means the models that assume that managers cannot lie does not fit into your setting. because earnings management means that managers are lying. The models that says managers can lie with no cost also do not fit into your setting, because earnings management is not costless. By similar logic, models assume that managers can strategically withhold information does not fit either, because you're talking about earnings management. Manager always has to report earnings. They cannot be strategically cited. So what you're looking for is you're looking for costly misreporting models. Let's say, suppose you find some costly misreporting models that seems to fit into your setting. You need to check that the assumptions underlying those papers are consistent with your setting. You also need to check the intuition or the driving force of the model is consistent with your intuition. For example, suppose the theory paper makes a few predictions or empirical implications about how the amount of misreporting varies with certain exogenous parameters of the model. For example, with corporate governance properties of the model, varies with the capital market incentives of the manager. You want to make sure that your empirical findings are consistent with those predictions. Let's say the model makes 3 predictions. If your findings are only consistent with 2 of them and inconsistent with the 3rd one, you cannot just cherry pick the 2 implications. You have to either choose a different paper or you have to explain to find a good reason why the 3rd prediction is inconsistent with your findings. Also, you have to know that all those theory papers on misreporting, in the theory, the amount of misreporting is well defined because all these theories, they have the true earnings. So misreporting is just reported earnings minus true earnings. But empirically, you do not observe true earnings. So you need to find empirical proxies. So this is the end of lesson 1. In the next lesson, we're going to discuss some basic math tools that will help you better understand how models are solved. We already talked about exogenous components and endogenous components are different. And so the math tools for dealing with exogenous and endogenous components are also different. For exogenous components, we very often use Bayes when Bayesian updating. For endogenous variables, very often we conjecture and verify. We're going to talk about those in more detail in the next lesson. If you want to test your understanding of the materials in this lesson, a review quiz of this lesson can be found at this link in the slides. Thank you very much for your attention.